Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking to a good friend of mine, Brian LaRossa. Brian is a design director at Scholastic. He writes essays for Design Observer and just recently joined the adjunct faculty in the design department at the City University of New York. I've really enjoyed getting to know Brian over the last 2 years or so. He actually started writing for Design Observer around the same time that I started this podcast, and we discovered that we shared so many similar interests in regards to design and writing and the type of kind of design discourse that we were interested in. And I've been looking forward to getting him on the show so we could kind of talk about all of this stuff. So in this episode, Brian and I talk about his background and his initial resistance to design. We talk about how he started writing and what it was like to learn about design's history and culture. And one thing that I really enjoyed about this conversation is that we also talk a lot about not just writing, but also reading and the value that Brian finds in books and reading and literature. This one was really fun. Brian's enthusiasm is completely contagious, and I think that you'll really enjoy it. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. These memberships really help keep the podcast going. I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Brian LaRossa. I reread everything that you had written on Design Observer to prepare for this. And your first piece, basically the thesis of it was that design is this inherently literary discipline. And I had forgotten that was your first piece. And I was struck by how that thesis, I feel like, can actually explain so much of your other writing since then. And so I kind of want to start just talking about that piece, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Where'd that idea come from, or this notion that design, because in it you and I don't mean to like explain the piece to you, but you draw this kind of comparison or this contrast between Milton Glaser, who talks about the importance of drawing, and you're like, yeah, that's important, but also reading and writing is important. And I think it's interesting that served as your first piece on Design Observer. It's almost like, kind of putting a stake in the ground. Where'd that come from?
I mean, it came from the same place that any piece that I've written, which is just kind of like this little feeling of an idea or something that that's nagging me, like something that I want to talk about or something that I want to learn more about or try to figure out. And like working in book publishing for so long, I just always had this sense. I mean, that piece talks about the kind of collaboration that happens between editors and designers, and in a way, I mean, like, especially when you're reading about design theory, like a lot of the things that are being discussed about the way designers think and move through projects, it's exactly what editors do. It's almost like in book publishing, like the designers and editors are kind of like two lobes of the same brain, like we're moving together and we're working together. So like there's a bridge there that's very natural. But it was, it's hard for me to think about exactly what I was feeling when I wrote it. At this point, it was a little bit ago, but to connect to the show, I haven't been writing for that long. Really.
Well, that was my next question.
And when I first started writing, I wrote that piece, and then shortly after writing that piece, somebody turned me on to the show, and I'm listening, and it was one of the early episodes, and it was, I don't know if it was Michael Rock or you were talking about him, and you were talking about that he said something similar, and I just finished this essay, and he said something along the same lines, like design is literary. I was like, oh, my people. I was what?
Design is an elaborate form of writing, I think was his phrase.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then I got so excited about this show, and like, there's a conversation here. Like I was already into writing, and then I was like, oh, and there's more of us, Well,
I think what strikes me. Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. But what struck me about it, reading it in retrospect, is that it was your first piece on Design Observer, and you hadn't done much writing before then, at least publicly. So where, I guess maybe to go back even further, where'd that interest in writing, or how did you start writing, or even reading? Because the piece doesn't just limit it to writing, but also kind of the importance of reading. Has writing and reading always been a part of your life or your career?
Well, I was anticipating you might ask this question, and I was anticipating. I was like, oh, I wish I could answer that really like succinctly.
Yeah.
But it's actually a long story. I don't think I could.
We have time.
I don't think I could describe it without describing how I came to design.
Okay. Yeah.
Otherwise, I don't know if it would make sense.
Do it. Go for it.
So in undergrad, I went to MICA.
Yeah.
And in undergrad, I studied illustration. And that program is very much focused on editorial illustration. And this is the late '90s. And I don't have like a lot of. I haven't seen data on like the type of contract usage and like how it changed over time.
That's interesting.
But our professors were really presenting like work for hire contracts, like it was a brand new thing, or not like a brand new thing, but like that it was becoming way more prevalent, right?
Yeah.
That it was damaging the field of illustration, and so like for anybody listening that's not familiar with work for hire, it's basically a contract that says, for the duration of the project, your work product is property of the company. And when you're done, you own no rights to it at all. So, like, but back in the day, illustrators would do projects, and then they would own the right. They would license it to the people, but they would still own the illustration. They could actually sell it again.
Oh, interesting.
So, I mean, I've always been a drawer, and illustration was working out well. I got a piece when I was a senior, into the Society of Illustrators student show. Oh, nice. I was like, okay, I could go down this path. But they had painted this picture of like, it's just not going to work out, right? Like, this is like trying to play for the NBA.
That's interesting.
And to be fair, my wife, Allie Rex, we started dating in college, and she was a year behind me. So I'm finishing illustration. I'm thinking like, I can't be an illustrator. It's not going to work. And you know what? Allie's got another year of school. I might as well go to graduate school. Which, like if I'm honest, that was kind of my thinking.
Yeah.
So I did this. I applied and got into this digital MA program, digital art.
And this was at MICA also.
MICA also. It was a 1-year MA. But I was already thinking like, illustration. So I thought very little of graphic design.
Yeah.
Art school kind of sets that up where you have these like departments and everyone's like, well, painters are going to starve and designers are sellouts. These ideas, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought little enough to design that I was like, I can do that.
Interesting.
I've never taken a single class on typography. I knew nothing, and I was like that boldness carried it over enough. Like I had some friends that went to Goucher, a friend from high school, who introduced me to someone else. They had started this zine, this newsprint zine called Manifest. And it was amazing. By the end, we had like 20,000 copy distribution across 5 cities. We were interviewing like Kali Lazen, the founder of Adbusters, all these artists and stuff. And somehow I became like the creative director of it. So I was like doing
this
all the
while
layout.
you're in grad school,
like
basically.
Transitioning from undergrad to grad school.
Okay.
I'm also working on this zine all the time. It's like this counterculture zine.
Yeah.
It's very like George Bush was president, and it was all very much like fight the system kind of magazine. But I was typesetting it, and when you look at it, it's I never typeset anything. It was insane. But I just like thought very little of graphic design. I could do this, So then the grad program starts September of 2001. So I don't need to describe that day for you, but that happened very quickly. Everyone was like, holy, it was major. It was a major paradigm shift. And one of the professors in the grad program lived in New York and was planning to come down. And this is digital MA, digital art.
Right.
This is like Fluxus. This is pre-YouTube, so people are like coming down with laser discs of Nam June Paik and like all these like Fluxus video artists. And so like it was this. We were not designers. It's digital art, but it's like
I'm glad you point that out, because when you said digital art, I was thinking about what it is now, and it's a lot of animation type stuff. It's processing things like that. But this is all pre that kind of even early internet-y.
It was kind of this weird transition from like this Fluxus video art to like internet art.
Interesting.
And the professor, I can't remember their name now, and I can't remember what they were supposed to teach. 9/11 happened, and they were like, I'm not commuting from New York City to Baltimore right now. Like, the world's coming apart. Like, this feels dangerous. I just got to stay close to home with my family, and, my city's under attack. Like, no, I'm not leaving it. So they were like, okay, well, and this is like within, the semester has begun, and these are graduate students that paid for this program. So I can only imagine what the director was like scrambling, like, holy shit, what do we do? And so graciously and amazingly, as you know, that she is, Ellen Lupton was like, I'll step in and teach a class on design. And we were furious. We were like, what?
Right.
What? We're not designers. We don't want to learn about design, you know? But she was incredible, and it planted a seed, you know?
So what was that class like? Well, like, what did she, to these people that, probably didn't care about design or didn't have an interest in quote-unquote graphic design, what kind of things did she do? What did that class become?
It was like half and half. And to be fair, she taught it with someone else, and I apologize, I can't remember even who she taught it with at this point. But one half was like ago. History.
Okay.
Design history, and the other half was like sophomore year type class.
Okay.
But for graduate students.
Right.
So we're like typesetting things. The only thing I remember typesetting was like she gave us a paragraph, and I was just and like I feel like the piece like represents how I felt about it. I like took all the punctuation alone, not the text, and enlarged it until it covered all the text. So it's just like this blob from the punctuation. Right. So it was almost just like tearing. It was almost like an attack on the whole idea of graphic design, like destroying the communication of it.
So how did you feel about, because you talked about the class in general kind of being not wanting to study design or design was this other thing. What, were you interested in it? Did it grab you? How did you... I mean, spoiler alert, you become a designer, so something, something happened.
Well, I don't want to say, like, I had an epiphany in the class, but it planted a seed, and meanwhile, I'm still, like, creative directing this magazine.
Right.
And so to, like, explain how I got to writing, like, at that point, as early as grad school, I already had this, like feeling that I needed to be doing more than one thing.
Right.
At all times. So, like, grad school's not enough. I need to also creative direct this magazine, because I just had a lot of energy. As a kid, they, said I had too much energy. But, like... so I finished grad school. Allie gets into Cranbrook for painting. Okay. She's a painter. She keeps a studio in Brooklyn.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she's a brilliant painter and huge, influence and inspiration on me. So I go with her to Detroit. She's at Cranbrook. Her minor, you're allowed to do like one elective. As part of the grad program there, and she did Elliot Earl. With Elliot Earl, she was in the design department. And I didn't know anything about who he was or the McCoys or any of the history of anything, and I was just like, oh,
that's so cool. Funny.
I didn't know enough to like if that had happened now, she'd be coming home every day, and I was like, okay, let's sit down, tell me everything that was said.
So you're just hanging out there, like what?
I started out working at a My Gym.
Okay.
Which is like one of those facilities that is gymnastics for little kids. So it's basically like running birthday parties.
Okay.
And like, they had a mobile ball pit. Like when the kids peed in the balls, it was my job to like take the balls and wash them. But this is Detroit, so it's like freezing. So I got this like net bag full of ball pit balls, and I have to go to the manual car wash and hang them up and like spray them down. And that didn't work for long. But I learned a lot from that job about public speaking, because I'm like commanding a whole room, leading this birthday party. But by the end, I was like, the hours weren't regular enough. I just wanted something steady, dependable. So I became a bank teller, very 9 to 5, very dependable. So I was a bank teller for the second year. I thought I was going to could get a job as design. Remember, I was thinking very little of design. I can do this. I actually even interviewed. I went and did a test at the Detroit Free Press, I think, the newspaper there. I show up there early on before even My Gym, and I go and like the art director's there, and kind enough to even just let me come in the door. This is like even before like Monster.com, so I'm like finding jobs in the newspaper. I like show up, and the job in the newspaper is like, come work at this newspaper. I was like, okay, and I show up, and he's like, we just need you to design this like 2-inch by 3-inch all text advertisement. And we need it in like an hour. And I don't remember what I did, but they didn't invite me back. I mean, I didn't know anything about type, so it's not surprising.
Are you still, at this time, working on this magazine, this zine, and are you still doing illustrations?
The magazine kind of, ran its course.
Okay.
I was trying to do freelance illustration here or there, picking up like jobs, nothing in terms of money, but just like little things. And I was basically spending all my free time working on my website.
Okay.
I was teaching myself web design.
Okay.
So I'm learning HTML, CSS, JavaScript. I'm making putting so much energy in this website, like really nerding out, so that doing things that were totally unnecessary, right? So like when you came to my website, the background would be different pattern every time, but it was like a subtle different, like no one would ever notice. I was like, it'll be fresh that way. But I learned a lot about the web, and I was trying to like, I designed a poster for my gym.
Okay.
So I was doing what I could to learn about type and to make this website.
So what's your relationship to that word design, or this idea of being a designer, of, finishing undergrad and kind of not thinking you could be a designer, and then part of your graduate school experience becoming a almost design history intro to design, to now applying for design jobs at newspapers, designing your website? Did this start to feel like...
No, I still didn't care about it at all. But I was like, this will be a way to.
So it was just a way to. Okay.
Well, grad school really got me interested in working as a fine artist. Also, just like thinking Allie is awesome.
Right.
Because she's this amazing painter, Cranbrook degree, and like she really knows what's happening in the art world. So like we finish, she graduates, we move to New York City, and my thought is like I'm gonna get a design job to support like our studio practice. I'm gonna be making art, and so I show up and like to acknowledge my privilege, like a family friend, works at Time Inc. and that is like. Was a huge help to me. It was like to have somebody like say, "Oh, I'll introduce you to somebody," and they introduced me to a designer at Fortune.
Okay.
And the designer at Fortune, looked at my website that I'd spent 2 years working on, and he was like, "I would change a lot of things here." We're meeting, and he's like, "I would change this and this and this and this and this, a laundry list," and I go home and I stay up all night and change all of it. I do.
You just take all his feedback.
I made every change that he asked for, and I sent it to him the next day. I was like, "How's this?" And he was like, "Let me introduce you to my roommate, who was Jaime Lucero, and he was a creative director at Scholastic." And he was like, "You know what? I'm hiring a designer. Why don't you come in and we can talk?" And I came in and just told the crazy story that I just told you of like I'm doing 600 different things and none of it very well, and I don't know, but he saw potential and was like graciously gave me a seat in his department.
I have a question. I have two questions that are kind of related, may or may not be related, because you get this job and then you kind of just work your way up and are now a design director of, like, how many people are on your team now?
The in-house team is small. There's like 3, but there's a good number of freelancers that we're working with at any time.
And so, you kind of plant yourself here, and this is almost 15 years?
Yeah, well, this is my 14th year.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions. Planting yourself here and having a really good career as a designer, but then that early interest of kind of wanting to do a lot of things. How did design become this kind of, I don't want to use the word comfortable, but I can't think of a better word for it, but become this base that you could kind of do all of these other things? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
what I mean?
Makes perfect sense.
And then the second part of the question is, do you still, how that desire to do all of those other things kind of filters in to now this umbrella of design?
So it took a long time. So when I first came, I was showing with a small gallery in Williamsburg called Like the Spice that a friend of mine from graduate school started.
Okay.
Marissa Sage. And so I was showing in all her group shows, and I was showing in other shows around. And,
nice.
And so I was spending a lot of my time doing that. And so I really was showing up to work every day like, this is how I'm paying the bills.
Right.
I learned everything. I learned so much on the job. And so I designed like 100 book covers before I started caring about design.
Okay.
I was just churning them out like it was a day job, like I was at the bank stamping checks.
But it wasn't the thing. It wasn't the thing you were interested in.
I didn't care. Right. Yeah. And but then when I turned 30, which was around the time Twitter came around. Like Twitter played a large role in my education, my self-education about design. I kind of, around the age of 30, like I started using Twitter, and I was like, wait a minute, wait a minute. I was like, wait a minute, does all designers don't wish they were artists? Wait a minute, design has its own history and heroes and institutions. Like, oh, this is news to me. Like, I mean, it makes me sound like insanely ignorant, but I just hadn't thought about it through that lens yet. You know, like I didn't know what Design Observer was. I mean, Design Observer was pretty new at that point, but like I didn't know who Michael Beru was. I didn't know what anything. I didn't know who Milton Glaser was. I remember being 30 and my creative director Jaime mentioning Milton Glaser offhand, because actually Jaime's creative director was Vincent Cecchi, who worked at Pushpin.
Yeah.
So there's kind of this like lineage from Pushpin to the way he was running the design department that I was in. And he mentioned Milton Glaser offhand, and I was like, oh, who's that? And again, at this point, I designed like 100 book covers, and he's like, what? You don't know who Milton Glaser is? And so I was like, oh, and it just started crystallizing. I started like using Twitter as like a catalyst of like, I should look up more about that. I should look up more about that. And around that time, I also met someone who ended up also becoming a mentor of mine, Russ.
Right.
Russ Diana. So Russ Diana was the lion of Scholastic's creative services. He started working here in 1964.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It was amazing. And he just passed away in January. But, you know, shortly after I joined Scholastic, but shortly before I met him, he started this group called the Design Forum here.
Okay.
Which, in his mind, the charge of it was to like connect and educate and inspire all the designers in the company. But not just that, but to like elevate the role of design within the company and to really celebrate it. And like not just to help the designers feel connected, but also to help like people in other job functions understand the value of design. So like editors and marketers and finance people even, like to see like, okay, design is important to the bottom line of this business. So he was hosting speakers here. So he hosted, like I went to a talk that he hosted with Stephen Heller. So like all this is happening at the same time, like Twitter.
And this is, I mean, and you've been here for a while now, and you're just kind of suddenly opened up to this.
So I just kind of, and meanwhile, I'm still making art on the side and stuff, but I'm starting to be like, wait a minute, okay, this is important. Like I started to see it differently.
It's interesting to me that I have a theory that, you know, kind of hearing you describe this story, I'm struck by, to take it all the way back to the beginning of the conversation in your first Design Observer piece, that you were an illustrator. You were drawing all the time, and you were then kind of working as a designer, and they were two separate things, and you didn't care about design. But then it was when you started kind of seeing the history and the theory and the writing about design, which is what kind of opened it up, and that it wasn't I don't mean to make such a harsh distinction that it wasn't the visual side, but it was suddenly there was this other side to it that you weren't aware of, and that's what opened it up for you. Can you talk more about just like why that grabbed you so much? That, you know, because I imagine that designing book covers, that there was some drawing involved in illustrating and all the things that you had been doing. What was it about suddenly seeing history and theory and writing and discussion that like flipped a switch for you?
Well, I mean, I would describe myself as a voracious reader now. Like I read today like I'm running out of time. Like I can feel my death on the horizon, and I need to get as many books squeezed in as possible. But I didn't read.
There's a philosopher. I'm sorry to cut you off. There's a philosopher. There's somebody who says something about like the stack next to your bed of unread books is like a way to fight mortality or something. Like it's I wish I'll find it and I'll send it to you, but it's something about like you accumulate books and things you haven't read as like a way to prolong death or something like that. I'll find it. I mean,
that is the way I feel. I kind of feel like I'm stretching my time by packing with books, but I wasn't always that way. That's also like something that I kind of came into through design, because I design books by thought leaders and literacy instruction. So I'm kind of like drenched in data on like the benefits of reading all day. And eventually like I just kind of drank the Kool-Aid, you know? But at this point, like early on, like when I'm first kind of like waking up to design, like it wasn't, I I wasn't doing a ton of reading, but it was the idea that there was a culture there. So my dad is a sociology professor.
Okay.
So he kind of had raised me to look at things through the sociological lens, in a way. By no means, I've never even taken a single course on sociology. So by no means, let me clarify, I don't know anything about sociology. But I was kind of raised in a house with a sociology professor. So
that's so interesting.
It definitely had an influence on the way that I value culture. I think it has an influence on what I write about. I'm not interested in writing about a recent logo. I'm interested in writing about the culture of things, the culture of design. And so what I kind of woke up into was that design even had a culture. Which it seems silly to not know, but I just didn't.
You're hitting on two things that are interesting, and I always get really self-conscious when I draw parallels between the person I'm talking to and my own kind of background in design. But you're hitting on two things that are directly parallel to my own experience. And I've talked about this first one on the podcast before, but just how my introduction to design, similar to you, I guess, was through Design Observer and Speak Up. And this was, Twitter wasn't even a thing at the time, but just kind of reading these blogs. And so my design education was almost inverted in that I knew a lot of design history and a lot of theory, but had no idea what kerning was. And so I think that's why a lot of my interest as a designer is still in that more theoretical side, because that's kind of the origin to it. But the other side of this is my interest in reading and culture. I think I can trace back to design also, in that before I discovered quote unquote graphic design, did not read a lot, even things kind of watching movies and things was just something that I wasn't interested in. But when I discovered graphic design, that became this lens that then suddenly the whole world looked different. And I was reading not just design things, but I was reading, novels and pop psychology, just anything I could get my hands on as a 17-year-old kid. And still, all of my reading, I feel is through this design lens. So I don't know. That wasn't really a question. Just draw.
I can relate. Yeah.
How did that change? How did that change the work then, or coming into Scholastic, where now maybe it wasn't just the thing to pay the bills?
I mean, it did change it a lot. Suddenly, and around this time, I was kind of moving away from art. At some point, I was always doing something on the side. For a while, I was doing experimental poetry, and I was doing digital art and showing and this, and then in the movie The Dark Crystal, at the end, the Skeksis and the Mystics combined. It was kind of eventually my side hustle or side projects started to become design focused, and it was a merger. So I wasn't even now I would say I'm still feeling I have energy to spend in more than one place, but and I'm spending it on writing, which isn't designing.
Yeah.
But the writing is about design.
Yeah.
Do you know? And the reading is about design. So I really view reading as a practice as well as writing. And so I feel all of these things are, even though now a lot of it is really filtered through that lens of design, I still feel scattered in a good way. In a way that's fulfilling.
To then talk about the writing, that kind of bring the writing side in. When did you realize, or you're doing all this reading, it's this thing that kind of made design a lot more interesting to you. When did you start feeling like you wanted to be a part of those conversations as not just a consumer of all of these texts about design, but that you wanted to add to it, or that you had something to say that you wanted to kind of put out there?
I mean, I think so art really died for me, and I'll use that word. It stopped being something that I could put energy to when my twin sons were born, which was an amazing, beautiful thing, and they take so much of me, to the idea of maintaining a studio practice, which somehow seems bigger. It just seems there's no more time for me to do that. So it was almost the pressure of this amazing, beautiful thing of my sons squeezed that extra energy into this efficiency. It like created this need for efficiency, and like writing just became the most efficient what form. Like I started writing, the first thing I started writing was a history of the branding of book publishing houses. On Design Observer, there's 20, but on Medium, I did 32. So there's a lot of book publishing houses, and I was doing like primary source research, interviewing, people at Random House, and getting all these like amazing stories about how these book publishers branded themselves originally, and reading, and I wrote that and just put it on Medium, but I didn't have any like goals.
Right.
I just was like, I'm not making art. I mean, in between art and this, there's this experimental poetry phase that's really hard to explain and maybe wouldn't fit into this podcast, but like that was really writing based, and so there was this kind of bridge of experimental poetry between art, and eventually like experimental poetry was even like too cumbersome, like it wasn't efficient enough, so it was just like, well, I don't need all of that, like I can just be the words. So like in writing that first piece about the history of branding, I was just trying to do something with this energy, with the little bit of time and energy that I had at the.
How did you arrive at writing being a way that could kind of fill that energy? Were you dabbling in a lot of things and writing was the thing that stuck? Or like, how did you kind of zero in on that? And then the second question may or may not be related. Specifically writing about design, I think is interesting. And, you were doing this poetry. Were you writing fiction? Like, were you kind of doing other writing, or like how'd you kind of zero in on the type of writing that you're doing now?
The poetry, again, I don't know if I can fit it in here, but it was like relational poetry. So it was like, it was writing, but it wasn't like, it wouldn't fit into any poetry magazine. A lot of it was experimental, and a lot to do with like socially constructed situations and things. It was pretty far out, but it was but there was writing involved. I mean, I've always had a sense that I can write. My education K-12 was like very focused on writing, and that was what was valued in school for me. And so like that's part of why also I didn't know anything about design, or like really even going to MICA. Like going into MICA, I didn't know anything about anything, because like my growing up, it was really the focus was writing. And my father is an author, and he valued writing, and so we did writing at home, like as a kid, and so like it wasn't something that was foreign to me.
Right.
And I actually I really see a lot of parallels between the design process and the writing process. So it was a natural flow into writing as a new outlet. And the reason for writing about design is, and this is like 10 years from now, I can honestly, at this point, see myself being a writer. Like, but not necessarily a design writer. Like,
talk more about that.
Well, I could. I don't know how I'll get there, but like that's something I could imagine at this point. I would never have been able to imagine that 5 years ago, because for me, like, I'm honestly interested in writing more than I'm interested in writing about design. Like design is what I know. They say like write what you know. So like I know a lot about design. I have a lot of hours clocked in experience and energy that I've devoted to it. So I have opinions about that. So it's what I'm able to write about. But it's really like at this point I get super excited about the act of writing. Like that is thrilling to me. It's like getting at the bone of it. Like the bone of the issue. Like almost like design is the flesh, and we're just like, all right, let's get down to where there's like nothing but language. Like what?
So you mentioned, I think this is so interesting, and I have like, I'm mad that you bring this in now, like, because we could have spent the whole conversation talking about this thing. But you mentioned that you see a lot of parallels between kind of the design process and the writing process. Can you talk more about those, or kind of even your own writing process and how that maybe is influenced by being a designer?
I mean, so I do all my writing on my phone, 100% of it. Everything I've ever written, I've done on my phone. And I tried to switch to a desktop early this year. I think we had lunch. And I was like, I'm going to start waking up at 5
That's right. I remember talking about this.
And sit down. And I did that for a month. Woke up at 5 a.m. and tried to sit down. And it just felt horrible.
Okay.
I just didn't feel good. It wasn't because it was early in the morning. I just don't like writing while I'm sitting at a desk or in a chair. Like writing on my phone, you're holding the phone closer to your face. You're like with the language. You're like holding.
And so you're like in the Notes app. Like, how does this?
So I use Word. Microsoft Word app, and I connect it to Dropbox.
Okay.
I have an elaborate folder structure where I have essays in progress. I have about 36 essays right now that have like one paragraph done there, like 1 and 4 paragraphs done, that I'm constantly like diving in, working a little bit, coming out, working on another one, and eventually like there's in the folder process, one will like graduate up to this, bubble up to the top and become like the one that I'm working on right now. And then that one becomes the one that I'm working on. And also being a father with a full-time job, like the phone allows me to write on the subway in the morning and in the evening, and in the evening after work, I'm able to right after dinner quite easily, or if I even just have 5 minutes to spare. A lot of times for lunch, like I'll wolf down my lunch at my desk. And then I'll go. A lot of times, if you guys want to find me, I'm on Wooster. On Wooster Street, just south of Houston. There's this great little step that I like to sit on and write. So I'll steal like a half hour.
After this episode comes
minutes.
out, your spot's just gone.
I know. It's gone. But so like my writing process is very much like integrated into my daily life.
Yeah.
Like all the nooks and crannies of it. And it's something that's just omnipresent in my mind. So like I'm constantly like mulling over something that I was working on in the morning, whether I'm like in a meeting about something else, like it's just something that I'm perpetually working on at all times. But I was thinking about it this morning. You're saying like, oh, how is design and writing similar? Design is a literary discipline. I wrote that early on. And I do believe that like the later stages of writing are very much like design. When you have like your 1R, but not the 1R that you share out, but the 1R that you have, then you're ready to whittle, like get it right.
Yeah.
Like that is very much like design, because suddenly like you're like the author, you've given yourself manuscript to the designer, yourself as a designer, and now you're editing and shaping and forming and like the times when it's most like design is when I grab a paragraph, this maybe the second paragraph, and be like, oh, this is the sixth paragraph, like a big move. That's like a big move, But recently I was thinking like, before that stage, it's not really the same. It's a little bit more like art, because designers are not creating their own content by and large.
Right.
I mean, yes, there's designers that write and design their own stuff, but at a certain point, like the line between personal projects and poetry just blurs completely. Like the majority of designers are designing text that they didn't create. And so that the beginning of the writing process where you're pulling out what you want to write about, and those beginning, when you writing those paragraphs and sentences, it's painful, but in a good way. Like, how can you get that to come together? Isn't really like design.
What does that step look like for you? Considering that you're writing on the phone, on your commute, on the step outside after dinner, are these? This is a very like reductive tactical question, but I think this is interesting to people, or at least it's interesting to me. Is that like bullet points? Or do you have sentences? How does that start where you're kind of this thing you're thinking about starts to crystallize in word?
So like when I was studying illustration, and even now when I draw, like, okay, I haven't used an eraser in more than 10 years. Okay. I never erase lines. To me, that's almost sacrilegious. The way I feel about drawing. Right? Yeah. I only draw with a pen, and every line is correct. Okay. As it should be. Yeah. And some drawings aren't correct, and that's fine for the purpose that maybe for the like if it's illustration, there's a specific purpose. If you're just drawing for yourself, they're all great. You know? Oh yeah. So. Yeah. And I never, I did life drawing. I can do life drawing. I know the, gesture, and then you fill it, you flesh it out in layers. So you're like, get a gesture of the whole scene. Like, I know how to do that, but it's never been what makes sense to me. Like, I start with one line, and it just kind of unwinds and spirals out. And so, like, for me, it starts with a feeling of, like, in design, if you have this feeling of dis-ease and you're looking at a piece of design, it's an indication but there's something in the visual composition that could be explored further, right? I use that as a compass in my role as a design director now quite a lot. So like to figure out what needs to be worked on. It's really like a gut feeling. So like in writing, it's almost like that same feeling of disease, but again for me, like I'm not interested in writing about a logo, but like in the culture, it's like a disease in the culture. Like I'm uncomfortable with my understanding of that, or I'm uncomfortable with the way that doesn't make sense to me, or I'm curious about that. And so from there, like it really starts at the level of a sentence, a single sentence, like, and then balloons out into a paragraph. But I might like rewrite a paragraph for really like 8 hours, like cumulatively over the course of a week. I might spend 8 hours rewriting sentences in a paragraph, really on a minute level of just like this language isn't quite right, this word isn't quite right, this sequence isn't quite right. And once I get like that first paragraph like crystallized in a way where it's like singing for me, then from there I can start to imagine, and there might be like some outlining that happens. Like okay, from here I can see we need a paragraph about this, about this, about this, about this. I mean, but the amazing thing about writing is like you finish all these paragraphs, and then all of a sudden, like a lot of times you'll get to the end and you'll be like, this. It's all wrong. Like, I didn't, because you don't know how you feel until you write it. Like, you don't understand what you think. Like, it's a process of getting there. So, like, in that way, it is like design. Like, you've gone so far in one direction, and you need to have the courage to like rip it all apart and put it back together using what you learned in building it in the first place.
Coming back to this idea that you mentioned earlier of writing and reading as being a practice, and I think even in the design as a literary discipline essay, you talk about it being kind of this thing that you have to like kind of train a little bit. How have you trained yourself to write in like when you have free time in those short bursts? What is that? Are you going in with I'm working on this sentence? Is it I'm just going to spend time in this text document right now? Like what's that? How'd you kind of get to that point?
I mean, for me, like reading is a big part of my writing process. So like, I'll open a piece up on my phone and start working on it with the idea that I'm just there to be with it and work on it. Not like I need to get that sentence right, that paragraph right. And basically what I do, even from the time that it's one sentence to the time that it's a paragraph, maybe that's why I can workshop a paragraph for 8 hours, is like from the beginning, when it's one sentence, I'm reading that sentence over and over. I'm reading it over and over. It's not right. It's not right. It's not smooth. There's still a bump in there. I'm reading a paragraph over and over again, and now I'm adding 2 paragraphs. I'm reading both paragraphs over and over again, and every time I get through, I change it. And there's really no time in the working process of beginning to like form the piece that I'm not reading through without changing something. Right. Every read through, I'm changing something. Yeah. And so like at the very end, and it's kind of my favorite place is when you have like 7 or 8 paragraphs, you have a beginning, middle, and end, and it's got a nice shape to it. And then you're like reading through and you're changing smaller things. You're just changing a word. And then by the very end, you're like, okay, I think I can make it through without changing one thing. Like for me, it's done when I can read it without changing one thing. And it's hard to get there.
What is your goal in writing? Like, what do you want to kind of add to this discourse, or what do you see kind of your position kind of contributing through your writing?
I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, that's like a look in the mirror question. Yeah. But I think I'm interested in there being a part of the conversation about just like who we are as a community. Like as a community, and I in listening to past episodes, there's a lot of talk of like, there is no community. It's all broken up, and there's too many different things. And I have some pretty specific ideas about like where those lines draw. Like like an architect, a product designer, a graphic designer, UX designer. At a certain point, like an architect and a graphic designer is kind of like a podiatrist and a brain surgeon, which is not like to place value on either one of those things, but it's like the head and the foot, like you're pretty far apart. Yeah. But I think on another end of the spectrum, when you're talking about like a print digital divide, to me that is a very superficial divide that I think people get hung up on. So like it doesn't matter if it's an interface or a wayfinding or a book or a logo. and this is where I think reading comes in. Again, they're all about reading. We're talking about reading experiences.
Right.
Whether it's an interactive reading experience or a static reading experience. We're talking about reading experiences. And when we use reading as like the common thread, then I think we do have a community of people with similar interests. And maybe the processes are a little bit different, and maybe their processes are a little bit reactive to the mediums that they're working in. But we're all talking about like how to help people to read and how to find their way through language, So
so who do you see as this is another big question that might be kind of weird to answer, but based on that last answer, who is your audience? Like, do you picture a specific type of designer when you're writing?
No, I don't. I really don't. I'm honestly like writing for selfish reasons to like figure out how I feel about things.
Yeah.
I'm interested in sharing them, but there's some comments on Design Observer, and sometimes people write back on Twitter a little bit, but it can really feel like you're just kind of like throwing messages, that are in bottles into the sea at night, and you're just like, I don't know. It went out there. I don't know. Yeah. Maybe people are reading it, but it felt good, and I needed to sort that out for myself. So I don't have like an audience. I said 10 years from now I could see myself just being a writer. I feel like I aspire to writing about things that aren't design. I don't know how to do it though. Like I can't figure it out. Like it's not comfortable for me yet. I've been reading a lot. Like I just finished a book of essays by Joan Didion, amazing essayist, spectacular. And she can write about anything. Like, and I want to be able to do that. Before that, I think like as design writers, like it's important to read books about design, but really like design, for by and large, it seems like the essay is a pretty like dominant form of writing within the design community. So, if we go beyond design writing and just look at the history and community of essay writing, like I've lately been reading like James Baldwin, Ta-Nehisi Coates, brilliant. Rebecca Solnit has amazing essays, and it's like there's so many amazing essays that aren't about design, but that form is the same. So there's things to be learned there. I mean, I aspire to be able to do that, to like give me like let me just write about this conference room right now. Can I write something that's moving about that or significant to anybody? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you started answering my next question, and you mentioned you had like 36 in draft essays. What are the things you're thinking about right now? What are some of the ideas in those drafts that you're working through? What are things that are on your mind that you're kind of working through writing about right now?
So I just finished an essay. So the thing I'm working on this summer is a book proposal.
Oh, nice.
For a collection of essays. And,
nice.
This is like I'm a heart on my sleeve kind of guy, so I'm just telling like everybody now, and so like when you don't see a book from me, it'll hurt that much more, right? But like just to be honest, like that's what I'm interested in trying to do right now. Can I put together a book proposal? And even if I don't succeed right now, I think I'll learn what it needs to be, and I'll keep trying. And in a few years, eventually it will get there, or maybe I'll get it straight out the gate. But so, like, I've been spending a lot of energy on crafting the language of that proposal lately. And in crafting that, I was realizing, like, it shouldn't just be essays that are already available on Design Observer. I need to also make essays that are exclusive to it.
Right.
So I have a few essays that I've written that I haven't given to Design Observer.
Keeping those.
I'm waiting to see what happens with the book proposal, and if it fails, maybe I'll just flood Design Observer with things. But I recently finished one about intersection of design and identity. This idea of like, we come to art school and we have this idea that we're talented, and the first thing we learn is that it's just totally mundane to be talented. Like everyone else around us is insanely talented. And then the professors come with these. The solution is, it's not about you being talented. It's about how you do what you do. Your unique voice. Come into this brilliant kaleidoscopic, realization of your true, unique way of doing what you do. And like over 4 years, that kind of calcifies into like this personification where we come out and we're like, I'm a designer, I'm an illustrator. I'm a painter, I'm a sculptor. Like, that's my identity. Striving for excellence in my work is the same as striving for excellence in myself. And I think the essay that is about that being a little bit dangerous in service disciplines. Where like, again, we said like, okay, in design, you might be doing a self-initiated project, but let's just say for the sake of argument, by and large, designers are working for clients. And if designer is the cornerstone of your identity and you have to kind of ask for permission to be yourself, it can be a little problematic. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
That's interesting.
I kind of have a fear of losing my job. Like I have the essays about that as well. Like I have this sense that I won't be able to get in their seat at the table.
Right.
You know, which I don't think is imposter syndrome, and I don't think it's neurosis. Like, I've met a lot of former designers. Like, the technology of design has shifted so many times and so hard over the past 100 years that there's a lot of people that didn't make it across the gap. And I'll be at a design event or I'll just be hanging out with friends, and you'll meet people that are no longer designers who were designers. So it's not outlandish to imagine that your career might end before you're ready to retire.
Yeah.
So I have this like fear of like the end of the. So yeah, the essay is kind of about exploring that fear and like trying to understand those feelings.
Do you think this kind of idea that in 10 years you'll be a writer is a way to kind of placate some of that fear? It's like you're planning your exit?
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe.
My last question is a question that I end all of these with, and you've already named a bunch of people that you're reading, and you mentioned that you're a voracious reader, so I imagine this is going to be kind of hard to narrow down, but who's on your reading? Who are the people that have like really influenced you? If you were putting together a reading list, who would you put on it?
Well, you know, being a fan of the podcast, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget.
Way to be prepared. I love this.
So 5. There's 5 books.
I love this. This is the best answer already.
So I mentioned Rebecca Solnit earlier, and she has this book, The Faraway Nearby.
Oh yeah, I haven't read that one yet.
The whole book is fantastic, but chapter 3, in particular, if you can't manage to read the whole thing, read chapter 3. It's about Frankenstein. It's about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Okay. It's about Mary Shelley, and it's honestly like the best piece of critical writing about a creative act that I've ever read, where she just moves between these like really like big, broad human ideas about like what it means to be alive and the specifics of the weather in the lead up to the writing, like what was happening in the region where Mary Shelley was, like the weather right before she started writing. So it's like this expansive look that really gets super granular. Also, it's brilliant. The other one is Jessica Helfand's Design, the Invention of Desire, which again like speaks about design in this really big way that I like aspire to be able to also write about it in that way. And I love that book.
Yeah, that's one of those books that I feel like I just turn to again and again.
So good.
And I just get something new out of it every time.
I love it. I really don't read books twice, but that's one that I would like to read again. Nigel Cross, The Designerly Ways of Knowing.
Oh yeah.
So, and this is not a new book, and it kind of like incorporates essays that were written in the 70s, but he was really looking at, and I wrote an essay about it.
Yeah. The first time we met, we ended up spending that whole lunch talking about that.
It's a great book, but he's really like making a case for design being a third area of general education, like this idea that it's intrinsic human knowledge, different from the sciences and art, and that it's like this different way of understanding the world. So, again, I guess like those 2 books, Jessica's book and Nigel's book, both are like ways of thinking about design in a really like big, broad way. And then like the 4th book to recommend for anyone a designer that's like interested in starting writing, or even if you are writing a lot, but is Verlin Klinkenborg's Several Short Sentences About Writing.
I love that book.
And he's on the editorial board of the New York Times, and it's this book that's written like a poem. Like the punctuation is such that and the cadence is really like almost like the whole thing is a poem.
Yeah.
And the topic is sentences, not paragraphs. He's really just talking about crafting sentences, and he gets deep into it, and he writes about it in a way where if you're a designer and you're interested in writing but you've never written before, and you read that book, you'll be like, oh, I can do this. Yeah. It's not that different from what I'm already doing.
I agree with that book. It like completely changed how I thought about my own writing process. The one piece from that I think about all the time, that like just for someone listening, not to steal your thunder, but put every sentence on its own line when you're writing. And so you start to see the length of the sentence, so you can start to see the shape and the rhythm of it.
I like that. I don't remember. Yeah.
That just blew me. I've recommended that to students. I've recommended that to friends who want to start writing. And I find it's like just this little detail that completely just changes the rhythm of the piece.
And that really is like bridging that gap between writing and design.
Yeah.
Now you're looking at the geometry.
Yeah.
Of the language. And then the fifth book, the last book, is A History of Reading by Alberto Manguel. And
I haven't read that one.
Oh,
that's been on my list forever.
So like, I haven't always been a voracious reader. So like the median number of books that Americans read is 5. So like for most of my life, I read
a year.
Okay. Yeah, a year. So for most of my life, I read 5 books a year. So like not a non-reader, but not like excited reader. But like now I read, like as I said before, like I'm running out of time. Like I can't read enough books. So like if you don't self-identify as a voracious reader, if you're not, but you're someone that reads like 5 books a year, or even like 2 or 3, like let me be an example of the fact that you could become someone that reads more. Like, and reading that book, The History of Reading, is like it is inspiring. Like it inspires you to approach reading as a practice. I mean, one day, I just kind of woke up and it's looking around, like anyone that I thought was amazing, like not just designers, but like all of a sudden I just, it's like you start noticing, you become obsessed with like maybe the number 32 and you see it everywhere. Right. So like suddenly like every single person that I was inspired by was like, oh, I'm a reader. When I was a kid, I was a reader. I was afraid. You just realize it's like this secret like key. So like, I mean, I would encourage anybody to read more, whether you're a designer or not. And I think like The History of Reading is a nice like doorway to like to like being able to empathize with somebody who's super excited about the act of sitting down with a book.
I love that. Was a great way to like wrap that up, like very encouraging. I love that you prepared that question. It's always a struggle for people, and this just made it so much easier. And I'm so glad we got to do this. I'm obviously a fan of your writing, and I've been wanting to get you on for a while, and so I'm glad we got to do this. Thank you so much.
This was a thrill for me. You can't really like plug a show on a show, but if somehow magically like this is the first episode of the show you've ever listened to, like you said I'm episode 91, you gotta go back and listen to the other 90. Right. They're fantastic.
That's great. Nice pitch at the end. I love that. This episode was recorded on July 12th, 2018 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.